After the success at Minsk, Army Group Center surged onwards towards Smolensk, where a further huge haul of prisoners was taken outside of the city. Despite the enormous reverses which the Red Army had suffered, the Germans were disconcerted to find that Soviet resistance was beginning to become tougher as the campaign progressed. The Germans were confronted with another and equally unpleasant surprise at this time. The first Russian T-34 tanks appeared during the Battle of Vyazma. At Berea, the Russian tanks simply drove straight through the 7th Infantry Division onto the artillery positions and literally ran over the guns. The effect on the infantrymen's morale was devastating. This marked the beginning of what came to be called the Tank Terror. In 1941, the T-34 was impervious to the infantry's anti-tank weapons. At that time, the German infantry was equipped only with 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns, but they had no effect on the T-34. A gun of at least 75mm caliber was needed, but it first had to be designed and built. In the meantime, only 88mm anti-aircraft guns could be relied upon, and those were hurriedly pressed into the anti-tank role. By the end of July, Army Group Center had suffered 74,000 casualties, against which it had received only 23,000 replacements. An ominous portent in the first month of a campaign which was to last for 4 years. The rapid advances of June and July began to slow as August dragged into September, and still there was no sign of the Russian resistance slackening.
By the beginning of July 1941, it was clear that the initial plan of Operation Barbarossa had failed. It had not proved possible to destroy the Soviet armies. They were badly battered and heavily defeated, but they had not been eliminated.
Despite its undoubtable success in the field, Army Group Center had failed to achieve the rapid capture of Moscow. At this crucial juncture, Hitler chose to intervene in the overall strategic plan. He decided that General Heinz Guderian and his 2nd Panzer Group should be diverted south to assist the German Army Group fighting there, instead of concentrating on the final drive towards Moscow. With hindsight, it was to prove a disastrous intervention, although at the time, Hitler appeared to have been vindicated. As seen here, in the newsreels of the time, Guderian and his tanks were able to penetrate deep into Soviet territory. They were to contribute to the huge victory when they combined with the panzer forces of Army Group South under von Kleist to produce a stunning encirclement which produced a vast haul of prisoners. This footage shows the link-up between the tanks of Guderian, with the white G, and von Kleist, whose vehicles are marked with the white K.
Guderian had been one of the most able theorists of German armoured warfare during the 1930s, and in 1939 in the invasion of Poland, and in 1940 he had also proved himself one of the most able commanders of German armoured formations in the field. He had commanded 19th Panzer Corps with distinction, particularly at the crossing of the River Meuse at Sedan in May 1940, but he was also an impetuous and somewhat outspoken individual who seemed to have great difficulty in sustaining cordial relations with more or less any senior commander he came into contact with.
As one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg strategy, Guderian was not fooled by the enormous haul of prisoners in the Kiev pocket. He knew that the essence of Blitzkrieg lay in a concerted thrust towards a single objective, and that objective could only be Moscow. He was not backward in making his views known to Hitler, and the furious response of the Führer sowed the seeds of the bad feeling between them, which would lead to Guderian's dismissal in December 1941.
there really was a problem about objectives. There was a question of investing Leningrad, that's the first one. The second thing was, from Hitler's point of view, what would be the most impressive and urgent objective? And the answer was, of course, to move to the south, that is, to move into Ukraine and possibly even further. So that I think the argument really is that there was an argument about changing objectives with respect to Operation Barbarossa.
The confusion with regard to the overall strategic objectives from Barbarossa really stems to a fundamental disagreement between Adolf Hitler and the Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, about what was to be the strategic objective of the campaign. Both Hitler and Halder, the German High Command, agreed that this was to be a war for living space, a war of annihilation, and was to be over as quickly as possible. They disagreed, however, as to what the best objective to achieve this was. Halder and the High Command believed it should be Moscow. Hitler, on the other hand, tended to oscillate between the acquisition of economic and agricultural resources in the south and the taking of Leningrad in the north. Halder and the German High Command tended to persist in their belief that Moscow was the decisive objective of the campaign and should be.
Despite the never-ending losses to both men and machinery and the tenacious resistance of the Red Army, Army Group Center continued to advance deeper into Russia, but the real prize still eluded them. Finally, in October, the stage was set for the final drive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon. In November, the Chief of the General Staff summoned the Chiefs of Staff of the 3 army groups, and also of the armies engaged on the Eastern Front, to attend a conference at Orsha on the Dnieper. The fateful question to be discussed was whether the German armies in the East should now dig in along the line of the present front and there await the renewal of decent campaigning weather in the spring, or whether the 3 army groups should continue to attack during the winter months. As regards Army Group Center, the division of opinion was very simple. On the one hand, there was the attractive prospect of reaching the Kremlin. On the other, doubts as to the ability of troops to complete this final thrust in view of their weakened condition. After this conference, immediate and detailed discussions took place with the actual commanders in the field. Field Marshal von Kluge repeatedly visited his frontline units and even sought the opinions of privates and NCOs in the frontline trenches. For days, the commanders deliberated, but the final decision was that one last attempt would be made, one final attack launched, with Moscow as the objective. There are a number of great battles and campaigns which can justifiably lay claim to being one of the turning points of World War II. Operation Typhoon must surely rank highly among them. With Guderian and his 2nd Panzer Group now returned from its exploits in the south, Army Group Center gathered all of its strength together for one last lunge at Moscow. It was an attempt that very nearly succeeded, despite all of the factors which were arranged against it. The offensive began in the clinging mud of the Russian rainy season, the Rasputitsa, which gave way to the bitter cold of the worst Russian winter for 100 years. Despite all these hazards and the tenacious resistance of the Red Army, Army Group Center continued to crawl its way towards Stalin's capital. By the first week of December, German troops reached the outskirts of Moscow. They were only 15 miles from the Kremlin, and the spires of the citadel could be seen in the distance. But they may as well have been 1,000 miles away. The Wehrmacht had advanced as far